The room went silent when the CEO laughed at the single father's degree. He had just called a community college education barely an education in front of 20 senior engineers, then casually asked why a man with a second-hand laptop and a modest diploma thought he belonged in a room filled with people from elite universities. The single dad lowered his eyes, swallowed the humiliation, and said nothing. But 3 weeks later, when a crisis threatened to derail one of the company's most important aerospace contracts, the CEO received a phone call that made his face go pale. NASA was not asking for the CEO. They were asking for the single dad, by name. Before we discover why NASA wanted him, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the idea that someone's background should never decide how far they can go. His name was Malcolm Veyra, a 38-year-old father who had learned early that life rarely gave people a fair starting line. He lived with his 10-year-old daughter, Sienna, in a small rented house on the edge of a busy industrial town. The house had peeling paint, a noisy air conditioner, and a kitchen table that served as everything from a dining table to Malcolm's office. Every morning, he packed Sienna's lunch, checked her homework, and drove her to school before heading to work at Helix Aeronautics, where he was employed as a systems integration specialist. Malcolm had not attended an expensive university. After becoming a father at a young age and losing the person who had once helped him financially, he had enrolled at a nearby community college while working nights. He studied engineering fundamentals between shifts, completed assignments while Sienna slept, and sometimes spent entire weekends in the college library because his house was too noisy for concentration. His degree was modest, but behind that diploma were years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and a determination that had never allowed him to quit. At Helix, Malcolm was the kind of employee people often overlooked until something went wrong. He was not loud. He did not brag about his accomplishments. He usually arrived early, carried a worn black backpack, and kept a small photograph of Sienna tucked beside his computer monitor. His work involved examining how different technical systems communicated with one another, and although his title was ordinary, his mind had an unusual ability to notice patterns that others missed. He could look at hundreds of lines of technical data and sense when something did not belong. His co-workers sometimes joked that Malcolm could hear a machine thinking. He always laughed along, but secretly he knew that his strength came from years of solving problems with limited resources. When you cannot afford to replace something, you learn how to understand it. Everything changed when Gideon Rourke, Helix's 49-year-old CEO, visited Malcolm's department. Gideon had graduated from an internationally famous university, built his career through aggressive acquisitions, and believed credentials were the clearest measurement of intelligence. He wore perfectly tailored suits, spoke confidently, and had a habit of making people feel small without ever raising his voice. During the meeting, Malcolm presented an analysis showing that a communications subsystem in one of Helix's aerospace projects could experience an intermittent synchronization problem under an unusual combination of vibration and temperature conditions. Malcolm had spent 4 nights studying the issue after noticing a tiny irregularity in the testing data. He carefully explained his concern and suggested a relatively inexpensive modification that could prevent a much larger failure later. Gideon glanced at Malcolm's presentation and then at his resume. The CEO smiled in a way that made the room uncomfortable. Instead of discussing the technical finding, he asked Malcolm where he had studied. When Malcolm answered that he had earned his engineering degree at Redwood Valley Community College, Gideon leaned back and made the remark everyone remembered. He said that perhaps community college was useful for learning practical trades, but serious aerospace engineering was another world entirely. He questioned whether Malcolm had the academic depth required to challenge a design developed by engineers with advanced degrees from prestigious institutions. Several people looked down at their laptops. Malcolm felt his face grow warm, but he calmly explained that the data was the reason he had raised the concern, not his resume. Gideon dismissed the issue and moved on. That evening, Malcolm sat in his car outside Sienna's school because he did not want his daughter to see the disappointment on his face. He stared at his hands on the steering wheel and remembered every night he had spent studying after putting her to bed. He remembered falling asleep over textbooks, drinking cheap coffee at 2 in the morning, and hearing Sienna wake up and ask if he was still working. He remembered promising her that one day all those sacrifices would mean something. For a few minutes, Gideon's words made him wonder whether he had been foolish to believe that hard work could compete with privilege. Then he looked at the handmade drawing Sienna had taped to the dashboard. It showed a rocket flying toward a blue sky, with 2 tiny figures standing beneath it. At the bottom she had written, "Me and Dad reaching the stars." Malcolm smiled through the sadness and started the car. The following weeks became increasingly difficult. Helix was preparing a major aerospace communications system for a critical demonstration, and engineers began encountering unexplained intermittent failures. The problem appeared randomly. Some tests worked perfectly. Others produced brief synchronization errors that disappeared before anyone could reproduce them. Teams spent hours checking hardware, software, sensors, and environmental conditions. Expensive consultants were brought in. Senior engineers argued over possible causes. Gideon demanded answers and became increasingly impatient as the deadline approached. Malcolm quietly returned to the data. Late one afternoon, while most of the department was attending a meeting, he noticed something strange. The failures were not random. They appeared after a very specific sequence of vibration changes combined with a narrow temperature transition. Malcolm compared thousands of test records and discovered that the system's timing algorithm was reacting to a microscopic delay between 2 independent components. The delay was so small that conventional monitoring tools had treated it as harmless noise. Malcolm realized that under certain conditions, however, that tiny difference could multiply through the communication chain and create the exact failure everyone had been chasing. He spent the night building a simulation. By sunrise, Malcolm had reproduced the failure on his laptop. The next morning, he presented his findings to the technical team. This time, Gideon was there. Malcolm explained that the original design was fundamentally sound, but a small synchronization vulnerability could become dangerous under extreme operating conditions. He proposed a software adjustment and a minor hardware timing correction. The changes were inexpensive, but testing them would require immediate attention. Gideon initially resisted. He reminded Malcolm that the company had already spent significant money on consultants and that changing the system at this stage could create additional risks. Malcolm did not argue. He simply showed the simulation. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then the simulation reproduced the failure perfectly. The room erupted into activity. Engineers began running independent tests, and within hours Malcolm's theory was confirmed. The proposed corrections worked. The problem that had consumed weeks of work had finally been identified. But the biggest surprise came 2 days later. Helix received an urgent request from NASA regarding the project. A senior NASA engineering team had reviewed Helix's technical findings and wanted to speak directly with the person who had identified the synchronization vulnerability. Gideon assumed they wanted the company's chief technical officers. Instead, the request specifically named Malcolm Veyra. NASA had apparently encountered a similar pattern during an earlier research project and recognized the significance of Malcolm's analysis. His ability to identify the relationship between environmental conditions, timing drift, and system behavior had impressed their engineers. They wanted Malcolm involved in the next phase of evaluation. Gideon stared at the email for a long moment. The same man whose community college degree he had mocked was now the person NASA wanted to hear from. Malcolm did not celebrate loudly. He went home that evening, helped Sienna with her science homework, and told her that something exciting had happened at work. She immediately asked whether it involved space. Malcolm laughed and said yes. Sienna ran to her room and returned with the old rocket drawing from his car. She told him she always knew he would get there someday. The NASA collaboration became a turning point in Malcolm's life, but perhaps the most important change happened inside Helix. Gideon began reviewing Malcolm's work history and discovered something uncomfortable. Malcolm had solved dozens of problems over the years, many of which had never received formal credit because he was usually the person quietly fixing issues behind the scenes. His community college education had never limited his curiosity. If anything, it had taught him how to keep learning without waiting for someone to give him permission. Months later, Malcolm was invited to participate in a NASA engineering workshop. He stood inside a bright conference room surrounded by specialists whose resumes once would have intimidated him. But this time, nobody asked where he went to school before listening to what he had to say. They cared about the quality of his reasoning, the accuracy of his work, and the way he approached difficult problems. Gideon eventually apologized. It was not a dramatic apology, and Malcolm did not demand one. Gideon admitted that he had mistaken prestige for intelligence and had judged Malcolm before understanding him. Malcolm accepted the apology but told him something Gideon never forgot: talent can come from anywhere, but people need someone willing to give them a chance to prove it. Years later, Malcolm would still keep his community college diploma in a simple frame above his desk. Beside it sat Sienna's original rocket drawing. By then, Sienna had grown into a teenager who loved mathematics and wanted to become an aerospace engineer herself. Malcolm never told her that she had been the reason he kept going. He simply reminded her that education was not about impressing people. It was about learning enough to solve problems that mattered. And perhaps that was the real lesson of Malcolm Veyra's story. A degree from a famous university can open a door, but it cannot guarantee wisdom. A modest education can still produce extraordinary thinking when it is combined with curiosity, discipline, courage, and years of refusing to give up. The world may judge you by the school written on your resume, the clothes on your back, or the size of your paycheck. But sooner or later, life has a way of putting your true ability in front of the people who doubted you. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to Hardworking Dad. Your support helps us bring more stories about ordinary people who refuse to let difficult circumstances define their future. And before we end, special request: comment "Reach the stars" below if you believe every hardworking person deserves a chance to be seen for who they truly are. Because sometimes the person everyone overlooks is carrying the very answer everyone else has been searching for. And sometimes, the road to the stars begins at a place nobody thought was important. For Malcolm, it began at a community college, beside a kitchen table, with a sleeping child in the next room and a dream that refused to disappear. NASA did not ask for him because of the name of his university. They asked for him because he had earned something much harder to fake. He knew how to solve the problem. And he never stopped believing he could.